June 1942. 6 months after the date which will live in infamy, the United States was losing. The Imperial Japanese Navy was an apex predator. They had swept through the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. They were faster, better trained, and possessed a mystical sense of invincibility. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had a singular obsession: the decisive battle. He knew Japan couldn't win a long war against American industry. He needed to find the remaining U.S. aircraft carriers and sink them in one final apocalyptic engagement. The bait was Midway, a tiny coral atoll. If Japan took it, they could bomb Hawaii into submission. If the U.S. Navy came out to defend it, Yamamoto would be waiting with the largest fleet the world had ever seen. But Yamamoto committed the one sin a commander can never afford. He assumed his enemy was broken. While Yamamoto's warships surged across the Pacific, the most important battle was being fought in a windowless basement in Hawaii, known as Station Shaipo. This was the home of Commander Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort and his team were codebreakers. They were listening to the Japanese JN-25 naval code. They kept hearing a target referred to as AF. Washington thought it was the U.S. West Coast. The generals thought it was the South Pacific. Rochefort was certain it was Midway. To prove it, he pulled a legendary stunt. He had Midway send a fake radio message in the clear, complaining that their desalination plant was broken and they were short on fresh water. 2 days later, they intercepted a Japanese report. AF is short on fresh water. Admiral Chester Nimitz now had something no commander in history had ever truly possessed: the enemy's entire playbook. He knew the date, the time, and the direction of the attack. But he had a problem. He was outnumbered 2-1. He needed 3 carriers. He only had 2. The third, the USS Yorktown, had been mangled at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Experts said it needed 3 months in dry dock. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. 1,400 workers swarmed the ship like ants. While the ship was still being welded, it sailed out to sea, the repair crews still on board. The trap was set. June 4, 1942, 4:30 a.m. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the Japanese First Air Fleet, launched 108 planes to strike Midway. He was confident. He didn't think the American carriers were anywhere nearby. But 200 miles away, at a spot called Point Luck, the Americans were waiting. The first 3 hours of the battle were a disaster for the U.S. Navy. Land-based bombers from Midway attacked and were shredded. Then came the TBD Devastators, the American torpedo bombers. These planes were slow, obsolete, and their torpedoes often failed to explode. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet found the Japanese fleet first. They had no fighter cover. Out of 15 planes, 15 were shot down. Out of 30 men, only one, Ensign George Gay, survived, bobbing in the water to watch the carnage. Wave after wave of American torpedo planes were slaughtered. To the Japanese on the decks of the Akagi and Kaga, it looked like a massacre. They were winning. But the sacrifice of these men served a hidden, brutal purpose. They had pulled the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the Deadly Zero fighters, down to the ocean's surface. And in the chaos, the Japanese lookouts stopped looking up. At 10:20 a.m., Admiral Nagumo was at his peak of power. His hangars were full of planes being refueled and rearmed. High-octane gas lines ran across the decks. Bombs were stacked in the aisles. Then, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, looked down through a hole in the clouds. He had been searching for an hour. He was almost out of fuel. But then he saw it. The wake of a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, racing back to the fleet. He followed it. And there they were. 4 Japanese carriers, laid out like jewels on a velvet cloth. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey's bombers screamed down from 14,000 feet onto the Kaga. At 10:24 a.m., Lieutenant Dick Best leads a small group against the flagship Akagi. One 1,000-pound bomb hits the flight deck, crashing into the hangar filled with fueled planes. At 10:26 a.m., bombers from the Yorktown dive on the Soryu. In exactly 5 minutes, the backbone of the Imperial Japanese Navy was turned into a series of floating volcanoes. Because the Japanese were rearming their planes on deck, the American bombs triggered massive secondary explosions. The ships weren't just hit, they were vaporized from the inside out. The battle wasn't over. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, launched a desperate counterstrike, crippling the Yorktown. But later that afternoon, American bombers found the Hiryu and finished her off. By the time the sun set on June 4th, the Japanese Empire had lost 4 fleet carriers. More importantly, they lost their elite pilots, the men who had practiced for years to master the art of naval warfare. They were irreplaceable. The final toll was staggering. Japan lost 4 carriers, 248 planes, and over 3,000 men. The United States lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, 150 planes, and 307 men. Why did the U.S. win? It came down to 3 things: intelligence, knowing where the enemy was before they knew we were there; repair power, the 72-hour miracle of the Yorktown; and initiative, junior officers like Wade McCluskey making the choice to keep searching even when their fuel was dangerously low. Midway proved that in modern war, the biggest fleet doesn't always win. The side that can see through the fog of war and strike first usually takes the day. For the U.S. Navy, it was the end of the beginning. For Japan, it was the beginning of the end.